Hey everybody, in this video we're going to look at the render props technique in React. Now this is a technique that's going to allow us to keep our code dry, to avoid code duplication, so that we can share state and functionality between components. So let's get started. So I'd like to start off by getting a conceptual overview of this idea of render props. So let's look here on the reactjs.org website. In their docs, let's look under render props. In here we can see the term render prop refers to a technique for sharing code between React components using a prop whose value is a function. So as far as the last part of this, using a prop whose value is a function, we're going to be looking at implementing this in a moment. But first, let's look at the idea of sharing code between React components. So imagine that we have these two components. Here I've just labeled them component 1 and component 2. And let's say that the code in component 2 is essentially a duplicate of the code in component 1. And yeah, this might be totally fine, but how could we improve our code to reduce this duplication, to keep our code dry? Well, what we're going to do is we're actually going to create another component that's going to act as a wrapper. And that wrapper component is the one that's going to take the state and the methods that were common to component 1 and component 2, and it's going to feed that state and those methods to both component 1 and component 2, because these components need the state and or the functionality of the wrapper component. And in our example, we're going to bring in the wrapper component, as well as these other components, component 1 and component 2. We're going to bring them into our app.js component, and it's in app.js that we're going to wire them up. We're going to wire them up so that this wrapper component is going to pass its state and methods to both component 1 and component 2. And in doing so, we'll have removed this code duplication by taking that duplicate code that was in component 1 and component 2 and just moving it into the single wrapper component. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And now you have the big overall concept. But let's see how to actually implement this with render props. So what I like to do in order to explain a concept is to create a very simple example. And that's what we're going to be looking at here in this video. I'm really trying to minimize the fanciness and the complication and just get to the heart of the concept here for you. So what I have going on here on the bottom here, this is my code. I'm in VS Code, and I've set up a Create React App project here. First on the left, I have my app.js file. This is going to be my app component. And at the moment, it's just returning an empty div. So what I've done is I've kind of scaffolded out the basic skeleton of what we need just to move forward with our example. And what we're going to do with this example is we're just going to have two buttons, and each button, when clicked, is going to increment a count. Now the components that I have are a wrapper component, which you can see here in my wrapper.js file. And that's going to be a class-based component. And this is going to be the component that holds the state and methods that we're going to pass into those individual components that need them. So this is that wrapper component that I mentioned before, which is going to help us to avoid duplicate code. And those individual components, which are going to be the ones that need to get the state and methods passed from the wrapper, are called counter1 and counter2.js here. So here's counter1.js. It's a basic stateless functional component. And then here I have counter2, another stateless functional component. And as you'll see, these are going to end up being just about the same, except for some minimal styling differences. Now, I also mentioned before that app.js is going to be the one where we're going to kind of wire up the wrapper, which is going to hold the shared functionality, and counter1 and counter2, which are going to be the components that get past this functionality. So you can see here in app.js on lines 3, 4, and 5, I'm importing all these different components. So since we talked about how the wrapper component is going to be the one to hold the shared code, or the shared functionality, let's start with that. Let's set that up first. So like I said, what we're trying to do is we're trying to have two buttons. Each one, when clicked, will increment a count. So let's start by setting up that count. Let's create our state object here. And on that state object, we're going to create a count property, and we're going to initialize that to 0. And let's do it like this just to save some screen space. And then when we click on each of these buttons, we're going to want a way to increment this count. So let's write a method for that. And let's call it inc_count, short for increment count. We're going to set this equal to an arrow function. And all this enCount function is going to do is it's going to call this.setState, and it's going to take that count on the state, and it's going to increment this.state.count by 1 each time. So each time one of the buttons that we're going to create is clicked, it's going to call this enCount method and increment our count by 1. All right, so this right here, this takes care of everything that we are going to share with the counter1 and counter2 components. Now what we need to do is to wire it up. So let's look at how we can do that. Well, this component is called wrapper.js, and we're importing it here on line 5 in app.js. So let's use that component. So here within our div, let's write some JSX. Let's use that wrapper component. And as you know, in JSX, we write our props as attributes on the component. So in other words, if I was to do something like this and I said count equals 20, for example, and then I wanted to access this count prop inside of my wrapper component, well, since it's a class-based component, I would access that count by writing this.props.count. Let's just try that really quickly. I'm going to comment these out because these two components aren't finished yet. That's what's causing this error right now. So let's save now. And in wrapper.js, let's just output this.props.count. And if we look here, we see 20 as expected. All right, so let's get rid of this. We're not going to use this.props.count. We'll get rid of it here too in app.js. And instead what we're going to do for the render prop, we're going to write an attribute. We'll call it render. And then what's going to get passed in here is actually going to be a function. So let's write a function. We'll write an arrow function in here. And it's actually this arrow function here that we're going to be using to return our counter1 and counter2 components. So inside of this function, let's return the counter1 component. And as you're going to see in a moment, because we've set it up this way, we're going to be able to pass the state count as well as the enCount method into this function here. So let's see how we're going to do that. So we're going to come in here in the wrapper component, and within this div, we're going to open a pair of curly braces. And because we have render being passed in as a prop in this wrapper component, we can refer to it as this.props.render. And because this render attribute, or this render prop, is a function, we can invoke that function here in the wrapper. And now that we've invoked it, we have the ability to pass the state or the enCount method here in our parentheses.
Oh, snap.
So let's say we want to pass the count. Let's pass that in as our first argument. Let's say this.state.count. And then as our second argument, let's pass in this method here. So we'll pass in this.enCount. So now this count on the state and the enCount method are being passed in as arguments to our render function or our render prop. And because we're passing it in here, we can set up this function's parameters to accept these arguments. So let's say the first argument, we can call it count. And the second argument, we'll just call it enCount. And since they're being passed in, we can now pass that here into our counter1 component. So we can say count equals count, enCount equals enCount. And now what we can do is we can go into counter1 here, and we can make reference to count and enCount. Oop, I spelled that wrong. Got to put a C in there. So we can make reference to count and enCount in counter1 now. So let's go ahead and do that. So here I have counter1. And since I said that we're going to have two buttons, let's have this component return a button. And what this button is going to display is it's going to display the count. And that's coming in as a prop. So let's pass in props here. And then we can get that to display on our button by saying props.count. And let's save. Make sure we save everything. And there we can see our button here. Now in order to increment it, we're going to want to use this enCount method here. So what we can do in counter1 on the button, we can add a onClick handler. And onClick, we're going to call props.enCount. Let's go ahead and click on the button. And you can see when we click, it increments the count. So all this functionality, it's all coming from wrapper.js. It's being passed down in this call to render, passed through this render prop function here into the counter1 component. And then we could style this a little bit if we want. Let's just give a simple color red to the number. And now what we can do is we can use this wrapper again. So let's copy and paste it. And now we have another wrapper passing down all that same functionality, but this time we're going to render counter2. And we can just take the code from counter1. We'll paste it here into counter2. Make sure we rename this to counter2. And then we can style this one a little bit differently. Let's give this one a purple color. And let's make sure we save everything. And I have to uncomment the import statement here for counter2. And now when we save, and let me get rid of this semicolon here. There we go. Now when we save, we can see the two buttons. This is counter1, counter2 here. And I can go ahead and I can increment each one independently. Because these are two different instances being created here. And that's basically the render props technique. It's a way of taking some shared functionality and putting that all into some kind of wrapper component or some kind of utility component, which has just very minimal markup and is really just used to pass whatever state and whatever methods into these other components that need access to those things. So thanks for checking out this video all about the render prop technique in React. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. Let me know in the comments down below what other topics you might like to see covered. And please go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you can get notified of new videos when they're released. See you next time.